Welcome to my channel. I'm Dave LeBlanc, and I'm pleased to be with Dr. James Tabor, who's decided to join us for this in the midst of his million projects, to join us for a conversation on Paul. We're going to be talking specifically, primarily about a book that he wrote in 2012 called Paul and Jesus. And then at the end of our time together, we're going to take a few minutes for James to explain to us some of the recent work and projects that he's been involved in that he's excited about. But as a form of introduction, for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Tabor, he currently is a professor at the Department of Religious Studies. I want to stick to the notes here so I don't misspeak. At the University of North Carolina. He's taught there since 1989.
You should say, sorry, University of North Carolina at Charlotte, so we don't confuse
specific.
It with Chapel Hill. Yeah. So
thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Very, very specific. I didn't realize it was two separate.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. And then he also was the chair of that department from 2004 through 2014. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He also previously held positions of teaching at University of Notre Dame and College of William and Mary, both outstanding institutions. He also has his PhD, is in ancient Mediterranean religions. And he's also done a lot of archaeological work. He's spent a lot of time in the Middle East, involved with digs in Qumran, Sepphoris, Masada, and other places as well. He's written 6 books. Several of them have been corroborations, beginning with 1985, Things Unutterable, A Noble Death with Arthur Droge, if I said his name correctly, 1992. Why Waco, Cults and the Battle for Religious Freedom in America. That's on my book list, by the way. I'll be getting that one soon. In 1995, perhaps maybe your most famous work, The Jesus Dynasty, a new historical investigation of Jesus, his royal family, and the birth of Christianity, came out in 2006. And a follow-up to that, I guess, would be, if you want to call it a follow-up, The Jesus Discovery, the new archaeological find that reveals the birth of Christianity. And most, well, it's not most recently now, but the book we'll be discussing today is Paul and Jesus, How the Apostle Transformed Christianity, which came out in 2012. I have the book. I've also listened to it 4 times on Audible.
Wow.
Well worth it. It's a phenomenal resource. So that was why I was excited, James, to bring you on and have you discuss this with our audience, which would be my channel and also with Netiv Online Learning. And of course, the context or the subtext for this conversation on Paul and why I feel like your work needs to be exposed to more people. I've done a lot of reading on Paul. I've read a lot of commentaries on Paul. As you know, there's been a lot of developments in Pauline scholarship from the New Perspective. You have scholars such as N.T. Wright and men like that. And you also have some of the more recent radical New Perspective scholars, such as Magnus Zetterholm, Mark Nanos, Paula Fredrickson, and some of these people as well. And in the midst of all of it, one of the things that I've often found has been missing is the political and socio-religious context of the time period. And one of the things that you did in your book that just really captured my imagination, and it's a simple point, and I was going to try to ask you to talk about this because so many people argue about the individual aspects of Pauline thought, because as we know, Pauline thought affects all of the church, whether it's Roman Catholicism all the way to primitive Baptist to modern swing from the chandelier charismatic evangelicalism. Paul is central to everything. So how you read Paul ultimately ends up being how you understand your Christianity. And of course, this recent trend to try to Judaize Paul and try to frame him as a Torah observant rabbi, of course, has created great controversy for those who adhere to that perspective. So you come in your book, Paul and Jesus, and I'm going to launch you here in a minute. You can talk at will, whatever aspect of this you want. But the idea that Paul wrote the earliest text, if we were going to believe the mainline scholarship, that the authentic letters of Paul, whether they're 6 or 7 or what have you, that they predate the gospel narratives that we have by some decades. According to most scholars, you make this observation that if we're going to read the New Testament properly, we should start with these authentic letters of Paul as the earliest known testimony of the church. And that, of course, has a tremendous ripple effect on the way you understand the New Testament, doesn't it?
And actually, thanks for that introduction, David. And I'm going to put up another book. We're up to 9 books now. And I think this Paul's Ascent to Paradise, this actually is a version of Things Unutterable. So I'm going all the way back to 1986.
I saw the blog post on that.
But it's been and I wrote it not as a popular book, but as certainly an accessible book. And I want to mention that as well. You can get it on Amazon. It's hardback, paperback, even Kindle. I think all of my books are that way. But yeah, this is Paul and Jesus. Yeah, there's a chapter reading the New Testament backwards. That's just my fancy way of saying it. If you were like me growing up, I grew up as an evangelical Christian. I was in the Churches of Christ, the Campbellite movement, the conservative branch, not the Christian church, the non-instrumental, as people certainly know in the South. Yeah, I went to Abilene Christian University. I also went to Pepperdine.
Wow.
But so typically as a kid, I just remember probably 10, 12 years old, I'm going to read and even though I'm, a young kid, a lot of people try this. They go, well, I'll start with Matthew, and they read Matthew.
That's what I did.
And usually you can make it through Matthew. Those names in the first chapter throw you a little, but you get through that. And then it starts, the Christmas story, yeah, and the wise man, and you move on. Sermon on the Mount by chapter 5, it's great. And you get through, and then you read Mark and you think, Mark, wow, this is kind of like a cut down version of Matthew, which it isn't actually, and we could have another program on the Gospels. And then you read Luke, and I think most people bog down by then. They get the impression that it's sort of repeating, if anything, John, yeah, this is great, believe in Christ and be saved and so forth. And then Acts is a great story if you can make it through 28 chapters. And then Romans. Well, Romans is not the place to start with Paul. No. It's his most formal treatise. It's absolutely essential what we're even going to talk about today. But it is more of a form, like I said, a formal treatise. So what I try to do, there's even an appendix to really clarify this, is that of the 13 letters of Paul that are with his name on them, I'm not including the book of Hebrews.
Right.
Most of us, we academics, don't think Paul wrote it, but it has certain Pauline ideas, and that's why it gets associated with Paul. The Torah is done away, there's a new covenant, and so forth. And of those 13, academic scholars are sure about seven authentic letters, and we could list them out, but I'll name them as we go. But Galatians and First Thessalonians is actually the first, and Galatians and Philemon, just a little one-page letter we think Paul wrote. But those are really important. The Corinthian correspondence that we call 2 letters, but it's probably more than 2, especially 2 Corinthians, and then Romans and Philippians. And you say, well, what about the others? Well, they're looked at in various ways. Some are really seen as Deutero-Pauline or pseudo-Pauline. I think Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians are a little more seen as secondary Paul, but maybe influenced by some of his thought. They go in different directions. So what most of us do, and I did it in this book as well, I did it in my dissertation, and most critical scholars do this, we confine ourselves to the 7 letters. I tell my students, if you don't like the idea that all 13 aren't by Paul, don't worry about it. They're the earliest. They are the earliest. It so happens that those 7 are the earliest. And think of it as core Paul. And that helps. We're like, wait a minute, so I can't look at Ephesians. And of course, you can look at anything. And the idea would be that if we take those 7 letters, we've got this incredible glimpse of the Jesus movement before it's a new religion, centered around Paul going to non-Jews in the diaspora, primarily Asia, Greece, and finally, eventually Rome. And it's very segregated. All of those letters can be dated in the 50s CE or AD. So here you've got this nice little, 7 letters. And I know the mythers and other people don't think they're authentic. Most of us are convinced that these are authentically passed down from the hand of Paul. And we don't want to get on that today. But given that, assumption, you can get all of Paul's core ideas just from those letters. So what I did in Paul and Jesus is I said, if I just look at those letters, and if I didn't take a position, I like Paul, I don't like Paul, I'm for Paul, I wish he never wrote anything. I mean, you think of the extremes. Paul's either the most important person, even above Jesus, for some ways of looking at life. Even Luther says that, or he might be the most apostate person, meaning he took the movement in a whole nother direction. So what if we don't begin with all of that and we just look at the 7 letters? What would be the best account of what those 7 letters? So it's really amazing the effect of this book. It is academically nuanced in the notes, but it's not a book for colleagues. I don't think I ever mention anybody's view of anything. You mentioned a lot of scholars, N.T. Wright and others, New Testament studies book. Well, N.T. Wright has argued this, and so-and-so has argued this lately, and Paula Fredrickson. And I, of course, read all of these books, but it's not like that. My idea was I'm going to sit down, took about 9 months writing, and I'm going to say one question: what does Paul really say? Now, if you can segregate it like that and get it clear, then here's what happened. People that love Paul actually like my book. At least there's a few things maybe at the end, Battle of the Apostles, that Paul broke, so forth. And they don't want that because they want to harmonize everything like Acts does, the book of Acts.
Right.
But a lot of it, they would say, wow, that is the best exposition of Paul's view of salvation I've ever read anywhere. And then people who think Paul took the movement off in a different direction would say, nailed it, Tabor. Look what he's doing here. That's not, that's not the original teachings of Jesus and so forth. So it seems like the Paul bashers and the Paul lovers love the book, not universally, but I intended that because I said, my job is, what does Paul say? Not, do I like it? Do you like it? But I want to get that right if I can. And as you know, I came up with these 6, I worked hard on these. What are the 6 great ideas of Paul? And I introduce them even in the introduction. And then I have, let's read the New Testament backward. And others, don't jump to Mark or something Jesus said and then put that back on Paul, because even though Jesus chronologically is before Paul, in terms of the records, those were written later. In some cases, certainly the Gospel of Mark, I think the author of Mark is aware of Paul's letters. So we definitely want to start with the letters. So it's important. It's a method thing. It's just like you decide how you're going to proceed. And so if people will go with me on that, it's like let's go down this path. When we get to the end, then we can talk about where did that take us? And let's look back on it. But I do start with a pretty startling sentence, which you wouldn't think is startling, and it won't be to a lot of your viewers or listeners. Paul never met Jesus, period. But believe it or not, when the book came out and I began to talk to relatives and friends, and they start reading the book and they go like, I didn't realize that. And it's like, you think, oh my God, you know nothing about the new, who knows about the Quran? Who knows about the Bhagavad Gita? A lot of people haven't really, they know the church or they know Christianity, or maybe they go to church to different services, particularly the more mainstream churches. They're not deep into Bible study. So I have lectured on this book all over the country and actually all over the world. And people a lot of times think that's a big point. Well, it is a big point, because if Paul never met Jesus, and yet he's telling you what Jesus said and did and taught. And so I guess you could say, Paul says in Galatians 1 very clearly, what I teach, he calls it my gospel. I explain that, and I go through all the references early on. And what does he mean, my gospel? Why did he say the gospel?
That's a big point, yeah.
Message. He says, my gospel. And he says, I did not get it from men in any way, and I did not learn it, like go to school and learn it. He claims that he had studied with rabbis and so forth. Certainly the book of Acts says that. It's not in the 7 letters, but we have other traditions.
Acts
studied with Gamaliel. Yeah, I have no reason to particularly doubt that. You can read in the appendix, I have a method for deciding if you have the letters, the primary letters, the secondary letters, the pseudo-Pauline letters, and Acts. How do you decisions if one says this and one says that? There's a way you could sort of go about it, but it's mainly sorting out the facts. But leaving that aside and sticking with the letters, Galatians is, I would start with First Thessalonians chronologically. Kind of program Galatians is that, obviously, because he said, I'm independent. And then you think, well, where did you get your gospel? And he said, I got it as a revelation of Jesus Christ. And people go, is that an objective? Is it a revelation about Jesus? Well, it is. But he makes it clear that it's also a revelation from Jesus.
Right. Because
he hears from Jesus. And that's a big, big part of the book. To realize that Paul talks to Jesus, Paul receives revelation. Now, fundamentalist Christians, it's like, of course he does. I mean, he's the 13th apostle, but for Paul,
of course,
it's sort of like last but not least. But then in the early church, there was the idea, but wait a minute, if you never met him, and we have people who were with him, not just people, his brother James particularly, who's movement, who presumably grew up with Jesus and heard everything as he developed into a mature adult and began preaching and teaching and so forth. And we got Peter, who was one of the first chosen, who accompanied him and so forth. Mm-hmm. So, and he mentioned those in the letter. But it's, and I would say, I don't think he hated them or opposed them. I think later maybe there was a break, and let's talk about that toward the end. But what he does want to make clear is what I'm preaching, if they accept it, fine. Don't, let them be damned. And he does say, if we or an angel from heaven preach any other message, gospel, good news, than what I've preached, and then he says, I got it from Jesus. So that puts him on a plane. Now you could say, well, James would have gotten his gospel from Jesus, and Peter and John. And okay, if that's true, and they're all saying the same thing, we could have the harmony that we see in the book of Acts. But as we read Paul's letters, we begin to see that that might not be the case.
Yeah,
and we can talk about that. So it's really important to see that. So yes, it's a revelation about Jesus, from Jesus. And then you have to begin to ask, well, boy, that has a concreteness to it. Mm-hmm. In other words, you've actually think of Mark has a message. It's written as Mark. So Paul, you have a gospel. He said, I have a gospel. And I have a book called The Gospel of Paul, but we can get it from his letters, you see.
Right.
So it's really important to start that way. And that way, if you see something later in the letters, in the Gospels, you can talk about, is that from Paul, or is that pre-Paul, or what is it? Is it different from Paul, and so forth?
Let me interject here, because you made a couple of points here that I think the audience would appreciate some clarification on. First, I have a question. You mentioned this opening statement, which I agree with you. I think it's a brilliant and profound way to open the book, because it's a profoundly simple and yet overlooked question. The fact that Paul didn't actually physically meet Jesus. And you're right. Most evangelicals don't question that because they just assume Jesus appeared to him. We have the Damascus Road incident in Acts, which is, as you mentioned, it's not in his letters, it's in Acts. But yet people just conflate those ideas. But I wanted to ask you, of course, you had done a lot of work on unearthing the historical family that may have represented the Jesus of the New Testament that gets rather mythologized in the text of the New Testament. But we have this person behind the scenes, perhaps. Was that research you did in the Jesus Dynasty Project, did it influence the way you approached your book on Paul?
Oh, yes, for sure. And it's right in Galatians again. If you go into chapter 2, Paul talks about, I went up to Jerusalem, and he says, by revelation. Isn't that interesting? Like, Paul's like this throughout his 7 letters, and really all of his letters. If he's making a trip or a journey or makes a decision, even to cross over from Asia to Greece, that sort of thing, it's, if he's hindered, he could think that Satan hindered him. He uses phrases like that. But if he's guided by God and makes it, he feels he's being led. So this is known widely in the history of religions, that people believe, I'm sure many of your viewers and listeners, God guides people.
Sure.
And so he said, I went up by revelation. So that's interesting. Not wants to make the point, I didn't get called on the carpet by James.
Right.
Like I knew there was a meeting and there was a necessity for us to get together and try to clear the air and clarify things. It had to do with mainly the single issue of whether a Gentile, let's just call them, because Gentile just means a nation, a person of the nations, a Latin word, but whether a non-Jew who comes to faith in the one God, that's key, not just Jesus, turn from idols to serve the living God. This is 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 and 10. It's an important verse in Paul for understanding what's at issue. He said, you turn from idols to serve the living God and to await his Son from heaven, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. That's Paul's gospel right there. I mean, it's capsulated. If I go up to Jerusalem by revelation and meet with James and Peter and John and all the apostles, and I lay before them what I teach Gentiles, are they going to agree that, yep, you got it, that's right, welcome them, and they will be delivered from the wrath to come? That's, people forget the eschatology.
Right.
The reason you're saved by Jesus is the wrath of God's judgment is going to be poured out on the world very shortly. Paul expects to live to see that. It's not going to be pretty. And it's going to be a time of great judgment. Will you be rescued? Salvation means to be rescued, not
right.
literally necessarily pulled away from it, but at the judgment, God will basically declare you not guilty. And how will that happen? And that gets into Romans.
Where we get into the theology, right?
So then he goes, he says, I went up, took Titus with him. I tell my students, I have these little phrases. Titus was a show and tell, like kids do at school, like I do this and I have this. So he said, here, I brought one with me. I brought a specimen.
So you guys,
he's not Jewish. Yeah. He believes, Titus, you believe in the one God. Yeah. And have you turned from idols, and do you live a sexually moral life? And I'm sure what people call the Noahide laws, just sort of basic morality for Gentiles that Judaism has always taught. And even though it's not explicitly listed, as you know, in the book of Genesis, as it's shown, it's wrong to lie and cheat and steal and worship idols and murder and be sexually immoral. So there you go. And even eat blood.
The Noahide code.
Even eat blood. So whether you call it the Noahide code or not, I mean, you just have to ask, what if the world was judged to be wicked? 6, what was their wickedness?
Right,
and so forth. So he's basically saying, is Titus okay? And they go, so he's not circumcised. No, there people get hung up on the physical thing. Remember, it would only apply to a male anyway. So I tell my students, think of that converting to Judaism. I know that that's not exactly the phrase used in the past. If you receive circumcision, you're bound to do the whole law. That's later in Galatians. Well, that's not some radical statement.
No, it's
Of
conversion to
course, if
Judaism.
you convert, what would you convert and then not do the Torah?
Right.
Like, what is a bar mitzvah?
Right.
Take the yoke of the Torah upon yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And as Jesus said, we don't totally leave Jesus out. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. This is rabbinic language. The yoke of the Torah is not to oppress. It's an image of an ox, pulling, or a horse or whatever, a yoke. But it's not like you're cruel to that animal, want to torture it with the yoke. But a yoke can be restrictive, and at least the version we get from the Gospels in the Q material, where Jesus says, "Come to me," and so forth. So there are different halakhic decisions about how. But I don't know of any system where you'd say, okay, if you're a male, receive circumcision, go to the mikveh pool, which is part of the ritual. You could call it baptism or whatever, but it's not going to the pool or the river. It leads to what's later Christian. It's not Paul baptism. We'll have to talk about that in a minute. Remind me to talk about the difference John the Baptist baptism and
that's
Paul's
a significant
baptism.
point.
It's very different.
Yeah.
But the point is, you go in the water and you come out and you're Jewish. And I've been to conversion ceremonies. Some of my friends converted to Judaism. My sister, that many will know who listen to this, Betty, converted to Judaism. And so when he says circumcision, just think of being a Jew, or becoming a Jew, really. Let's use that, becoming a Jew. So that's the question. It's a pretty good question. And, the rabbis have already answered it. So actually, it's no big, profound thing that Paul is defending there. He's basically telling them, yes, you could, as a born Jew or a converted Jew or even a teacher of Judaism, could have the view that as people develop along and leave paganism and come more into the light of Torah and the prophets, wouldn't they want to draw closer and closer and closer and keep more and more, and then finally end up converting? Well, thousands of people do that, so mostly because of marriage, but not all. More and more we've seen in the years. I've followed the B'nai Noach movement probably for 20 years, since the Vindel Joan days, when it got, really well known out in the public, and the Wall Street Journal article. I guess it's probably maybe even 30 years now. And so lots of people are drawn for reasons, and they decide, I just want to be fully Jewish, right?
Right.
But the rabbis have never said, well, then, in order to please God, we know in the rabbinic literature, the righteous of all the world have a place in the world to come. That's the slogan. So Paul is basically just saying, you guys recognize that, right? We're okay?
Yep.
And so, but if they had said, no, Titus, he's come pretty far, and we're not going to say he's got to do it today. But it would be really great to hear the news maybe in a year or two, Paul, keep teaching the young man. He's great. We don't want to run him off. But we'd love to hear the news that he's become circumcised and is fully committed to Torah like you are, Paul.
Right.
You're Jewish. And it's not required. Of course, if Jesus comes tomorrow, poor old Titus is not going to be under the wrath of God. He's been forgiven of Jesus Christ. So anyway, but here's what I want you to notice, and I know you know this, Dave, but he says, but I went up, I put my gospel before, and basically what I just said, lest I should be running in vain. He uses that race language, running races.
Yes, the marathon, the very, very Greek.
Working on this for years. This is probably 4950. He's been, actually the record in Acts, I think I would accept the parameters of it, that he's gone to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe and those towns in Asia Minor and so forth, that because you can correlate that letters, it seems to fit pretty well. But the main thing is that he set up communities by the 50s that before even he goes to Greece, probably, depending on when you date Galatians, there's the early and the late view. But if you go early, it's either 14 or 17 years after his conversion. And you don't know which one, because he says 3 years I did this, and then 14 years later.
Yeah.
And does he mean 14 additional years, or does he mean from the time I first was converted, it was 14? Doesn't matter to me. But the point is, you're just getting up to, say, 50.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I laid it. And then this slips out because he's upset. And we'll talk about why he's upset. He's not upset about the meeting in Jerusalem. That actually went pretty well until we get to Antioch with Peter, and we'll get to that. But let's say it hadn't. He says, I laid it before the reputed to be pillars.
Right.
What they are means nothing to me.
Right.
Now, that could be taken overly harsh, and I don't want to make it overly harsh. Like, I don't really care who they are. I don't like them. They're nothing. That's not what he says. What he's saying is, I've got the message from Jesus. I've been applying it to hundreds and hundreds of people. These are amazing people. They worship the one God. He's able to say, our fathers passed through the sea, 1 Corinthians 10:1. In other words, we're all part of this new extended experience of a so-called spiritual Israel. And if they had said, no, he said, then they'd be wrong. And I would just stand up to them, because apparently there were people in the movement. We know this. He says it in Galatians, and he calls them brethren who came to spy out our liberty, is the old King James term. Yeah. To try to put us under, or put them under a burden that neither they or our fathers are able to bear. There, he's probably even talking about the oral law, because he was raised a Pharisee. And he considers not just the written Torah, but all the accessories that go with it in terms of how do you keep the Torah, what's called halakha. Halakha, how do you walk? How do you keep the Sabbath? Mm-hmm. How do you define this and that? You name a commandment, and the next question is going to be, Dave, would that be, this is what we discuss in Torah studies all the time.
Right. How do you do this?
And how it apply to Jews and how it apply to Gentiles. But notice his attitude is just so, it's just so resolute, is the word I would use. Because you'd already said, I don't even care if an angel comes and tells you something.
Right.
And then I love when he says, even if I told you, that thing I told you about the revelation, I've got some new stuff. It's not even right. Tell me to, literally, it's go to hell.
Right.
That's literally what it is. Because it's let him be anathema, which means let him be cast into Gehenna.
Just like he
and
tells
we say
them,
today, go to hell.
I want you to be circumcised. I wish they would go castrate themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Comes up. So just want to point that out, that what they are means nothing to me. Does have a context, so I don't want to overdo it. But what he means is, I am so sure of what I'm teaching and what I read, mm-hmm. that even if they opposed it, I just walk away and say, sorry, you need to get with Christ. You might have known him. I
appreciate that's the second point that I was wanting to hammer on with you here a little bit. I think you just did a wonderful job here in that explanation you just gave of kind of dragging in some of the modern scholarship perspective with traditional Pauline perspective. You've just basically synopsized the argument for both. But there's a sticking point, isn't there, with Paul, that I think your book, and I think it's really interesting, because I didn't know this, that you receive praise from both anti-Paulinists and also people who want to promote Paul's gospel and support what they perceive he's saying. But there's a certain element of it that you do a wonderful job of highlighting in the book. And it's this aspect that you're talking about right now, this idea that Paul is so resolute, as you put it, that he has received this revelation that has an authority that is higher than anyone that he's dealing with at a peer level. And of course, that, I think, creates a problem from a Jewish perspective, because, for instance, if you have the Jamesian crowd in Jerusalem, where, according to church tradition, James, the brother of Jesus, is put in authority over the existing church, and they respect him as such, and he's the final vote, I guess it is, at the councils and whatever.
And we should just call it even the synagogue or the community of the Nazarenes, because we call it the church, and that's what church means. But it's a Jewish sect or school of thinking. It has its own halakhic tradition from his brother, and it's a bona fide sect of Judaism.
Right, and it seems to be centered around the temple, and they seem to have this community there. And then Paul comes along, and like you said, he's talking about my gospel, which seems to be, by inference, perhaps somewhat distinct from other messages of the God. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about along these lines, because to me, I just found the most fascinating part of your book is this metaphysical aspect of Paul's revelation, where he's relying so much upon these heavenly visions that he receives. He's not, you never find Paul quoting, when Paul's talking about dietary laws, for instance, he doesn't say, as we know the teacher hath said. He says, I have it on authority from a vision. He claims a vision. Even when he talks about the Last Supper, you have a whole section of the book on that. And I just think that this has to be really delved into, because in Judaism, of course, we have this principle of disciple to teacher. So in Judaism, we have, this sage, son of that sage, has said, and therefore I now say to you. And that you have a break of that tradition with Paul, although he claims to be Pharisaical in his allegiance. He's very much a maverick in the way he presents his ideas. He doesn't try to claim the authorities, even as you mentioned, going out of his way to say, whether we want to take it pejoratively or just prescriptively, that I'm not held to the authority of these men. I'm held to another authority. I got it directly from Jesus. That does put him in a kind of a box by himself, doesn't it?
And remember, we're dealing with the most simple issue, and that is, do Gentiles who come to believe in the one God and commit themselves to the basic ethics of the Torah as applied to the non-Jewish world, are they required to convert to Judaism to, quote, be saved, or to have a place in the world to come? That actually is not some big, there were people pushing the other side. But we can see how James, Peter, John, and Paul could agree on that. That's not really the problem.
Right. Although people argue about that, that's not the core. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the question would be the implications of it practically. But what really would distinguish Paul from, say, James and the other apostles would be what he calls the mystery that is now being made known through my preaching to the Gentiles, that was never known before.
Yeah.
And he says things, although, I'll quote it. I think I can quote it exactly. We no longer know Jesus kata sarx, according to the flesh.
Right.
Now in English, we think of flesh as sex or something. No, he means as a human being.
Right. He's not in the,
he's in the spirit. He says he's a life-giving spirit. Flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom. So he's already had this great transformation that I'm sure we'll talk about. It's actually the biggest idea in Paul by far. Now, we don't know whether James and the apostles had that full idea or not. That could be part of because when he taught in this book, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, I thoroughly go into that even more.
I have to get that book.
Paul and Jesus. Yeah, you'll really delve into it. But he does say that not even the rulers of this world understood this secret. It's actually the word mysterion, secret.
Mm-hmm.
And if they had known it, they wouldn't have killed Jesus. But God fooled them with this message and what he actually did. And it has to do with what he calls the glorification that's coming. Now, in the letter of James, he does talk about being the first fruits. He says we are a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And we know James is later, and is it really from James? And is it verbatim? Is it a Hellenistic treatise with his name? So forth. So I don't know if we don't have things from James the way we do from Paul, like letters and so forth. So they might have agreed with some of that, but what we do know is that Paul feels that he's the latest, last but not least. And even when he says that, he says harder than them all. I mean, there's something going there.
Yeah.
And he does see himself in a role. I'd like to save this for later in our discussion, but I think he sees himself in a role as a kind of a second Christ,
Yes.
a second anointed one.
Yes.
And we can talk about that. And again, this book
the
goes into that
language
more.
he uses. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he would still say, look, my gospel is not unknown in the Torah and in the Tanakh. You can find it. He quotes Habakkuk. He quotes Genesis 15, 17. Is it 15 or 17? The just will live by faith and so forth. No, that's Habakkuk, but he says something about Abraham believed God and it was counted for him as righteousness, the way he translates it.
That's Genesis 7.
Yeah, right, Genesis. Yeah. So he thinks he can ground it, and he tries to, even in Romans, he quotes these passages. But whether James and Peter would have even formulated it quite that way.
Right.
Even in the book of Acts, you get more the idea that it's God anointed Jesus and sent him to preach the good news of the kingdom, and sick and cast out demons, but he was crucified according to the foreordained plan of God. And then God raised him up on the third day, and he's ascended to heaven. He's going to return again. So repent and believe the gospel and be baptized, Acts 2:38, and you'll have the remission of sins, and you'll be ready for what we call the coming of Christ. Now, I don't know that Paul would say, no, that's wrong, but he would say, well, wait, there's some things we need to explain there, because when you repent, what did you repent of? Did you repent? Oh yeah, I basically am a pretty righteous. I've got a few things I've messed up on. Well, Judaism already covers that.
Right.
You just turn to God every day and ask for forgiveness. Read Psalm 51 if you're really in trouble. Have mercy on me, oh God, according to or Micah 5. My students have real trouble. They think forgiveness is like Jesus did forgiveness or something, or the loving God who pities his creatures like a father and so forth. None of that is new, as you well know, and as I'm sure most of your viewers know. That's just fundamental to any view of Judaism, is the goodness and merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and righteousness.
13 attributes, yeah.
So if you thought, like Paul said, I used to think this, that I'm basically blameless, but yeah, I sometimes mess up. But in Romans 7, he says, no, that's not actually it. It's actually a problem of flesh. And he says, he basically says, you can never overcome it. In other words, all humans are under the power of sin, and there's no way out. You're under the power of sin, the grip. It's got you gripped. And even if you say, but like the Pharisee of Jesus, I fast twice a week, I give to the poor, I do all this and that, and the sinner goes, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Even if you realize, well, yeah, I make some mistakes, but basically I'm a good person. When somebody dies, a lot of times you'll hear, especially if it's my God, all grandmothers are great. They're really not, but mine was, yours probably was.
Yeah.
Well, if anybody's going to go to heaven, grandma, whatever, she'll be there right with Jesus. Well, not according to Paul. I mean, if she wasn't, because he said, the good that I would, I do, evil that I would not, that I do. And if that's true, he says, I find that to be a Torah, a law, meaning you can't violate it. It's like a principle. And he says, if that's true, then I'm hopeless. Oh, wretched man that I am.
Who will deliver me from the body of this death?
Sin. Yeah. Excuse
Well,
me.
can I ask a question
Yeah,
right at this
sure.
point before I forget? 'Cause I don't want to. I want to pin the point you made a moment ago about this redemptive aspect. We'll, like you said, we'll save that for a little later. I do have a question on that related to the Gospel of John. But you've been touching on this aspect now that I wanted to bring this up earlier, but this is a better time. One of the things that always fascinated me, and it was a real sticking point for me as I was trying to work out my worldview on spirituality after I was migrating out of Christianity towards Judaism, and in Romans, of course, which is, like you mentioned, it's the treatise on probably the most important epistle used by the church to establish doctrine. Maybe Galatians and maybe Ephesians would be 2, 3, perhaps, but that's debatable. But Romans certainly is right there. And in Romans, he makes this very what seems to me to be a somewhat convoluted argument, because if you ask the average Christian, at least the evangelical Christian, what do they think is the most important statement Paul perhaps made? I think many people would answer Ephesians 2:9, that we are saved by grace, not by works, lest any man would boast,
Right.
So the whole idea, like you were just articulating, the whole idea that, this wretched body of death, who will deliver me from this body of death, as he says in Romans, this nature that we have that we can't escape. Well, as I studied the Kabbalah, I started learning this idea of, you have the Sitra Achra, and then you have the dark side, and so you have this constant test going on. But within the Jewish framework, you've got this test framed in the context of God is merciful. God, as you were saying, God is merciful. God is gracious, 13 attributes of mercy. Yet we have this ongoing test where we fail, we stumble, we get back up. Well, Paul seems to be articulating very much the same idea. And then when you look at Romans chapter 2, I think if more Christians were to read Romans chapter 2, apart from conflating it about what they already assume to be true about the gospel, and you read the statements he makes in Romans 2 about how is God going to judge people? He's going to judge people according to their evil or righteous deeds. And those who pursue righteousness are going to inherit eternal life, and those who do not are going to inherit wrath, and they're pouring up wrath onto themselves. Well,
That's
that
right.
certainly doesn't sound like Ephesians 2:9 or his argument in Galatians that the law is past that. You're right. So we have this, it's almost like there's an overlay that people have of Paul, where the automatic presumption is that he's positioned himself against the Torah, and that now it's completely, but of course it gets conflated and conflicted with this notion that he has of himself, as he's kind of positioned himself separate from the rest of the tradition of apostles, and that confuses matters, don't you think?
Yeah, Romans 1 and 2 is probably the hardest two chapters. When I teach Paul every year usually. They're the hardest to get across. Romans 1 is okay. The wrath of God is against, all sorts of sinfulness and idolatry and so forth. And but let me make this statement. Romans 1 and set up the whole thing, especially chapter 2. He's setting the reader up. And then chapter 3 is whacking them down. Now, how is he setting them up? He's giving you a hypothetical way that God deals with the world, which is actually what Judaism teaches if it's really under spiritual depth. And he says things like, it's not the hearers of the Torah that will be justified. Notice it says justified, but the doers will be justified.
Right.
Now, leave chapter 3 out. Leave Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 out. Just read that. And then he explained, I would call the most logical approach to religion that almost people have in their mother's milk. To those who by patience and perseverance do good, he'll give grace, glory, immortality, and so forth. And to those who do wicked, wrath and fury upon, because God is no respecter of persons. So chapter 2, I say it's hypothetical in this sense. If you make that your religion, whether you're a Jew or Gentile, that's basically the biblical faith.
Yes, measure for measure.
God's
Yeah.
going to judge people according to their deeds. Now he deepens it with what the rabbis call kavanah, intention and inner. And he says, and that's the only place that Jesus comes in, when God judges the secrets of the heart by Jesus. Jesus is going to been appointed the judge to thoughts and intents of the heart. And then he says something interesting. So if somebody's a quote Jew, circumcised, observant Jew, but they don't do the Torah, and somebody is not a Jew and they do the Torah, written, he says, as written in the heart. You see, because in eating blood, I suppose, most of the Noahide laws are pretty universal, especially if you have the one God. Most religions, most cultures, should I lie, cheat, steal, be sexually immoral?
Right.
I'm not
pretty
talking about all the fine points. Even Richard Nixon, I'm not a liar. He didn't say, of course, I lied tons of times, or any president. There's honor among thieves, right?
Right.
What do you mean you're stealing my share? Oh, we're talking about stealing now, and you just stole the loot? Isn't that interesting? So you can't get away from that. But notice what he says. He says, so who is really a Jew? And I know this culturally doesn't fit Judaism, but in terms of thinking how God will finally work the judgment, it does. You could have a perfectly, quote, observant Jew who has no love of God whatsoever and actually resents God and says, yeah, I'll do it. And if they're around, who knows, maybe I won't, that sort of thing. Or just somebody who's wicked and doesn't really repent. But he says a Gentile who doesn't have the law becomes a Jew to God, Jew being used for one who is pleasing to God. So he's kind of playing with, and that could be problematic culturally. He who circumcises of the heart. Now there are people go, finally Christianity. No, I believe Moses said, yes, circumcise your heart, not just your flesh.
Right.
So this is actually taught in the Torah. What it means is that you are a devoted lover of road faith, you're pursuing righteousness. But you realize that you need grace. And so if you get eternal life in the world to come, it's a gift. Judaism teaches that. You didn't, quote, earn it. Right. People don't all understand that. So in chapter 2's hypothetical meaning, he thinks that that's the way justice would work in the world. But guess what? Chapter 3, nobody qualifies.
Right. Notice, and that's the sticking point.
The hearers of the law will be justified. I mean, the doers, not the hearers. And he goes, okay, step forward. You claim to be a doer, huh? Let's check you out a little bit. Let's start looking at your life and so forth. And then he comes out with his famous statement, none is righteous, no, not one. Quotes the Psalms, David sinned, everybody sinned. So it's all by grace. But this is the step that would define Christianity. And I talk to my students, I talk about, what would a rabbi say to Paul after chapter 3? Like chapter 2, the rabbi would agree with.
Well, he'd be right there with him. Absolutely.
Totally.
Yeah.
But when he gets to chapter 3, none is righteous, no, not one. The rabbi would actually say, yeah, I mean, all of us, it's going to be by grace. And he even says that in chapter 2. But toward the end, what is it? Verse 20, 21, right in there, he says, but now through the blood of Jesus, who's been given as a sacrificial offering for our sins, we can have forgiveness. And then he had already Abraham, who's justified by faith. He understands it as he who through faith is righteous shall live. That's Habakkuk.
That's Habakkuk 2:4, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if you look up Habakkuk 2:4, he's really misapplying it.
Yes.
Taking it right out of the context. The context is, if you think God's promises are delayed or not taking longer, this could be end of the age, it could be anything, just a promise of God. And don't worry, the vision is still true. And apocalyptic groups on this. It's quoted at Qumran in the Habakkuk Pesher. They talk about
Yeah,
this.
I was going to get to that.
Because
yeah.
the just one,
Mm-hmm.
the doer of the law, will live by faith.
Right.
Like, I can't see that God's ever going to do that. Like Abraham, you're going to have a son. He lives by faith, and his faith is counted as righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
The rabbi there would just say, I don't see any blood of Jesus.
Correct.
In other words, he believed God, the faith, the trust, and it was counted as righteousness.
Right.
Actually, I'm not even sure that's what that verse means. Habakkuk, I know it doesn't mean what Paul says.
Doesn't he also do violence to Deuteronomy 32? Yes. He seems to misapply that as well.
And I'll tell you, I think Rashi discusses this, and it's in different commentaries. You can translate it, and Abraham believed God, and he counted it for righteousness, like accounting, like infinite. Right. You could also translate it, he trusted God and counted God as righteous. See, you follow that?
Yes.
Look at,
right.
If you look at the Hebrew,
way that you use the word.
He believed God and counted it as righteous, counted him as righteous.
Right.
You know, God's going to do what he said, and I believe it.
Yep.
Not that that's how he got justified. I could go with Paul's, but to say he who through faith is righteous shall live, that's not what Habakkuk says.
Right.
It says you've got to live, if you're just righteous, you got to live by faith. Obviously.
If you could indulge me for a second.
Forget God, forget his promises.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you. I didn't mean to.
That's okay.
Yeah, I thought you were done.
So then we have this little debate in class where sometimes we even act it out. It's fun. Like somebody does Paul, and then I do the rabbi usually, and I say, oh, well, great, down to this verse right here. But I remember, didn't your teachers say 2 men went up to the temple to pray? One was righteous and one was a sinner.
Right.
Do you think he really meant that the guy that was righteous was okay? Because keep reading. And the sinner said, God be merciful to the sinner. And then he goes, and that one went up justified rather than the other, meaning the other needed it too. Another saying of Jesus, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. This is like it's kind of like a joke or a riddle. It's like if you say to me, look, I'm a Jew and I keep your Christianity, you know, I don't need grace. I don't need any of that. There's a certain sense in which you would say, hey, if that's your perception of yourself and you're ready to go to the judgment, you know, go with it. Because
right.
you'll be in Romans too. You've done good.
Right.
Rabbi would say, now, wait a minute. The guy wouldn't even lift his head to heaven. He got grace. Like, what about David after murder and adultery? Psalm 51, he got grace.
Mm-hmm.
But did he get it through Christ? Now, then, of course, you get into theology. Well, the blood flowed backward and it forgave everybody of all history and so forth. You can find that in Paul or not. He does seem to talk about something like, you know, propitiation for human sin. And I think he did believe that. He who knew no sin was made to be sin for us. And he doesn't just mean this generation, but all of humankind. But that idea of a human sacrifice, the sins of the world, and that forgiveness is based on that rather than the integrity of God as a heavenly father, like you would forgive your own child.
Right.
That's the crux of the Pauline message. Now, what we don't know, of course, Peter and James believed in grace. And we believe, as he says to Peter, that we're all going to be justified by the grace of the Lord Jesus. Mm-hmm. But we don't have records. I know we have 1st and 2nd Peter, but that's really problematic. 1st Peter is probably the most Pauline letter in the New Testament if you read it. Almost every phrase is
it's very
Paul.
Yeah.
2nd Peter is just another whole subject. But we just don't know. And what we get from Hegesippus and other accounts that Eusebius preserves of James, he seems to fit more in the milieu of Qumran, as Eisenman has said, or of kind of messianic Judaism. And of course there's grace, but it's not based on temple or sacrifice. It's based like the prophets. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Paul clearly thinks let me make this clear. It's not just adding a point of doctrine like, oh, well, let's add Christ and then we got Christianity. It's cosmic salvation. This is the most important thing in the book.
Yes.
Salvation for Paul, in a way, it's not you little creature getting somehow forgiven by God. God can forgive you with the wave of the hand. But aren't you still a mortal, flesh and blood, breathing person of the tomb? Yes.
Right.
And the judgment to follow. So salvation is cosmic. And so what happened in Christ, as Paul sees it, is that something took place. And this is just basic Christianity. Luther and Augustine, most evangelical Christians, it's a cosmic transaction that took place. Mm-hmm. And outside of that, you're not going to really have it. Yeah, there's forgiveness before, and there's an understanding of basic principles, circumcise the heart and so forth, right. Love God. But that's not going to save the world. Why? Because the world is passing away. It's decaying. Paul thinks that the planet itself has to get saved.
Yes.
Because it is in bondage to decay like your body.
Yeah, that it's groaning. Yeah.
Now, that's not a matter of God in heaven sitting and making a judicial judgment on your behalf. The difference. Mm-hmm. God could say, okay, not guilty. I'm justifying you by grace, by my own forgiveness. Or he could say, because of the blood of Christ. And then you would live your life and you're covered by the blood, as people say. And then you die. But what enables resurrection, as it's called, because it's not really the resurrection, as you know from my chapter. What people call the resurrection is just a subsidiary question on what happens to do the dead get to participate in cosmic redemption? Right. That's all it is. And everybody, 1 Corinthians 15, that's not the resurrection. Yes, it's the resurrection, because the answer is yes, they get to participate. But could we please say participate in what? Those are going to bring them forth from the tomb. Mm-hmm. And now they're going to participate in what? Because the living also get transformed.
Right.
And that's the cosmic salvation. Now, Paul would say that's only through Jesus.
Right.
Because he who is in the form of God, and here I go with an Adam Christology. Philippians 2. I know you can take it as he's in heaven, he comes down to earth, but another way to read it, and that's also more in this book, and I could go either way with it. It's discussed a lot among New Testament, but you could think of reading Philippians 2, and that's authentic Paul, Philippians 2, 2 through 10, as he's in the form of God, Adam. Adam's in the form of God. He doesn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Adam and Eve in the garden, they grasped. So he didn't act like Adam and Eve in the garden, but he emptied himself and, humbled himself and became a servant and so forth. Mm. And then he died on the cross, and then he was highly exalted. So that's the cosmic salvation process, which he inaugurated. Now, he says in the first, have this mind in you, which he also had. So if you want to participate new Adam creation and this new heavens and new earth and this redemption of the earth itself and the heavens, which are, we talk about principles of anthropic principle and the law of thermodynamics and so forth. If you want to participate in some sort of version of that Isaiah hints at by talking about a new creation, then Jesus is the inauguration of that. And if you reject Jesus, you've rejected, it's not just, everybody thinks it's like, oh, are my sins covered by the blood of Christ? Yes, that's part of it. But what you've really rejected is God exalted this flesh and blood mortal human, formed him into this new state. And now he has the power to subject everything in the universe to himself. That's what 1 Corinthians 15 is about. Right. The redemption of the whole creation. And it's a process. Christ is the first, those at his coming, dead and living. So but as I said, I'm repeating, included in what? Included in this transformation. So as I say to my students, it's going from a worm and a caterpillar and a cocoon.
Right.
which is just not that impressive, to a monarch butterfly. Now, we've already got one monarch butterfly, and you're a worm on a twig somewhere.
Yep.
And do you realize what has just happened? This thing has emerged. It's just an analogy, but he uses seeds and
yes, he's very Aristotelian the way his argument goes.
So it's not really, people, the big argument about, well, there's got to be continuity. Every single New Testament scholar I know disagrees with me on this. They go, yeah, but you plant the seed, so it's still got to come out as part of the body. And I want to say, no, what are you talking about? Atoms? Like, are you talking about the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen? And my corpse has to get regathered. Guess what? August. Yep. God will do it some way.
That's what I was saying. Like, it's almost like atomism. Like you've got certain. One of the things I found interesting as a segue here, as we get towards wrapping up some of these final ideas you wanted to articulate, in the study of like if you consult scholars such as Moshe Adel and Gershom Scholem who talk about the Kabbalah. You've got some developments within the Kabbalah that harken back to Platonism, atomism, some Aristotelian thought. You'll certainly find out with the Rambam. And you see, it seems like in an anachronistic way, you can take thought processes from Lurianic Kabbalah, and you can superimpose it upon some of Paul's ideas, and they seem to mesh. They seem to fit. And that's where I like you just said. I mean, this problem that you're talking about. We could go on. I could let you go on for 2 hours, and you wouldn't be able to exhaust all the different ideas that you have on this. But this idea of this, this blood thing, this sort of magic blood that it covers this whole process, this transformative aspect. To me, it would be very, very separate from a Jewish conception of redemption, which is more of a corporate identity. When I was reading Gershom Scholem, for instance, he distinguishes the Christian conception of apocalyptic messianism versus the Jewish conception of the same idea. And he says, as you're probably familiar, he says in the Jewish apocalyptic messianic concept, you have an event which is very public, which can't be ignored by anyone, whether they're believers or not. There's a transformative event that affects the entire community. Paul certainly doesn't back away from that idea, but it seems that Paul is more emphasizing this concept of Jesus in me, this inner transformation, this like Christ resurrected in the imagination of my spiritual imagination.
It inaugurates this.
Gone with it.
Yeah, he says our outer form is wasting away, but our inner form is being renewed every day. It's almost an embryo. It's a pregnancy image that the world is pregnant with this new family of God. They're developing embryonically, and when they come out of the womb, so to speak, out of the material world, they emerge in giving spirits. And the way you know that is there's already been one. Jesus of Nazareth has been seated at the right hand of God, and he's the firstborn of many brothers. So that's Paul's big idea right there. Much of that could fit into Judaism, but it wouldn't hinge on this. Like it's going to come because God is going to bring it about in the cosmos. Almost a teleological view of the cosmos. Where's the cosmos headed through this process of material creation? And for Paul, because he thinks he's right at the end, remember, he doesn't think there's any years. And so he's actually thinking it's here. And like step one, wow. And step two is coming just maybe next summer. And we're all going to get transformed. And then there'll be a period of destroying every enemy and the judgment and all that. And then God will be all things to all. So he's got this, maybe even a universalism, perhaps. By the way, on that, whenever students come to me and they say, well, Dr. Tabor, they want to talk religion, outside of class or whatever, I always tell them, I want you to read one book besides mine. You can read my books, of course, but Hugh Schoenfield, not the Passover plot, or Schoenfield, as he said it. I blogged on this recently. I should mention jamestabor.com. People can go look at that. Blog. It's got all kinds of stuff. And I blogged on Schoenfield just recently, I think last week. Anyway, Passover Plot was his bestseller, but Those Incredible Christians, it's available. Read for all we're talking about, but look at the two appendices, the Christology of Paul and the Christology of John. It's their appendices. And what he shows is that those ideas are already emerging in certain kinds of Judaism, but they're not hinging it on the historical Jesus being the linchpin.
Right.
Obviously, they were before him. But for Paul, we're not just talking about some set of rules and did you keep them perfectly and do you need grace? And if you do, you're covered by the blood of Jesus. Talking about, and I know you want to cover this a little bit, and we can have another program in the future, but baptism, it's not just dipping in the water as a sign of transition from the old community to the new community, like John. People who repented, accepted John's baptism, they're not now a part of the new messianic movement. But for Paul, it's the beginning of the burial of the old man. And it pictures the resurrection or transformations that's coming at the end. And then metaphorically, I die daily and so forth. And the same with the Lord's Supper. The body and blood is the way of participating in what he calls the koinonia, the communion of Christ. So this heavenly body that is in heaven, transformed now and immortal, you actually get you get fed by that body. And then you get into Catholic Protestant, is it the real substance or not? But this is good Christian theology because they base it on Paul. Now, was that what happened the night he was paid, which I think was, a Wednesday night, and I think he died on a Thursday, and that doesn't matter for what we're talking about. But anyway, I have a little bit on that. You mentioned it earlier, and I'll send people to the book. I don't think on the night Jesus was betrayed, I think he probably did have a last meal with his disciples, and James was there too. We think we have sources that James was there, but what he did is a normal meal that Jews know very well, and particularly at Qumran because it had messianic overtones. It's a anticipation of the messianic meal when the priest anointed and the messianic messiahs, priest and king, sit at table with the congregation, and that's what he said. I wanted to eat this meal with you, but I won't eat it again until I eat it in the kingdom. So it's this anticipatory meal of actually being in the kingdom together. Jesus talked about this a lot. You'll see Abraham, Jacob, right? People will come from east and west. They'll sit down in the kingdom, but you will be cast out, and so forth. You'll be out of the city, Gehenna. So I know people get really upset at that and say, "Oh, so Paul's made that up or whatever." I don't know where he got it. What I'll tell you, he got it. He said, I received from the Lord that which I delivered unto you. I don't know that anybody, probably a couple renegade crazy people like me, would say, oh yeah, he's claiming he just got that from Jesus. Most of them would say, well, that just means that the tradition of the Jerusalem church, he went up to Jerusalem and said, well, I want to tell you, we eat the body and blood of Jesus, regularly here. And let me explain the spiritual meaning. I don't see that. I don't know what James does or does not reflect of the historical James. I would tend to think it's in the right direction, and it has no Christology, no blood of Jesus. Jesus is meant once just in the opening to say, who he is. And again, talking about the faith of Christ in treating the poor equally with the rich in the synagogue, don't hold the faith. But it's not, that's why Luther said, oh my God, that's like eating a mouthful of, he said, I can't even chew James. It's just has no spirituality whatsoever. I read James and I think, oh my God, this is so close to the Sermon on the Mount.
Sure.
It's so close, but it's very apocalyptic. And we have to remember that. So,
but you make an astounding point right there. If I could just really emphasize this, because again, as I already said earlier, this is one of the most powerful parts of the book for me. This vision that Paul claims that he got from Jesus about this Last Supper, which, like you just said, most Christians don't even think that way. They conflate the ideas of the accounts in the Gospels with what they read in Paul. and they just assume that Paul is passing on by tradition something that happened that he just happened to not be there for. But the reality is that if you were to take James or any Jewish observant person, especially somebody that's a Jewish zealot, like what we found, in the Qumran communities or what have you, the idea that they would conceptualize their attachment to Jesus as a Zodic figure in the form of simulating the eating of his flesh and blood. I don't care what's in John chapter 6. That's not really a Torah
It's hard
concept.
it's not just hard to imagine. For me, it's inconceivable.
Right.
Now, Bruce, do you know Bruce Chilton's idea? I would
I'm not sure.
consider, different possibilities. Bruce says, and you can get this, by the way, Biblical Archaeology Society has BAR, Biblical Archaeology Review, but also Bible Review that they don't publish anymore. And I really encourage everybody to join that BAR library because it's so cheap. And you get 9,000 articles from all the years Herschel Schenk's published, and it's still going on.
Yeah.
So it's just fabulous. Anyway, you can read his article there, and it's also in his books. But what he says is that they're asking about the Passover, the lamb.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," meaning we don't need the lamb, not that he's the lamb, but this bread and this cup of wine will now, be remembrance of the Messianic era that's going to come. In other words, you eat it until he comes. He gives kind of an argument for that, that it's not like this is my body like my body, but they're saying, well, we need the lamb and we need to splash blood on the door and we need to do all this stuff. And he goes, you've got it right here. Kind of an idea that sacrifices were never, really intended. And we got versions of, if you know Josephus, there's a version called Yopisan, which is the Hebrew Josephus. It's not complete. You've also got other versions, Josephus especially, where John the Baptist doesn't eat flesh or drink wine.
Right.
And that's actually alluded to in the Gospels. One says he didn't eat bread or drink wine. The other says he neither ate nor drank, which doesn't means he doesn't eat flesh or drink wine. Son of Man came eating flesh, drinking wine. So it could be something like that, that you're anticipating the Messianic banquet. And in the Messianic banquet, I don't even know that you'll be eating because it's a spirit, it's a world to come. But eating would symbolize the fellowship, the closeness. I feel it on a Friday night. I've been in many Sabbaths, Friday nights with Orthodox people or people who just observe the blessing of the bread and the wine. It's very similar to that. Everybody's gathered around. It's quiet and it's you invoke the Sabbath and the women do the prayers. It's very beautiful. And then this wonderful ceremony. So what are you doing? You're kind of making your table the kingdom of God, even though you're mortal sitting there.
Right, exactly.
But you're not doing some cannibalistic thing.
No.
That
you're welcoming the Sabbath queen, the Kabbalat Shabbat prayers and
Exactly. Yeah. So I think he's now I don't know how long we're going to talk. Probably you judge. We can talk a little more, but we probably need to talk about other things. Was Paul observant of the Torah and all this kind of.
Yeah, that'd be
maybe we could even do another show. It might be better.
That'd be wonderful.
Not to do so much at once, but kind of pull people in with some of these ideas, and then.
Well, let me segue.
But you decide because you're the host.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I don't want to overstay and make it go too long. But
you usually do. Do you use it for a couple hours in your programs?
Most of the interviews I do of scholars have tended to go about an hour and 45 minutes.
Yeah. So we're getting there. Yeah.
We got about 15, 20 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. I'm okay. I got my.
Yeah. So I feel like
this is green tea, not coffee. So I got my green tea.
Oh, I got some of that waiting for me too. I meant to
drink coffee in the morning, but afternoon I love to drink green teas.
Me too. I find that the coffee too late in the day, I get heartburn from it.
Yeah.
but the green tea doesn't seem to cause that problem. I agree with you. I guess we're getting older, right? Our bodies change a little bit.
I think it's just healthy.
Well, it is healthier, but I used to drink coffee. Of course, that's why I had terrible sleep habits too, you know. But anyway, I'm better now. But I think you really, you've kind of opened up the flower of this subject in such a way that I don't want to leave it unattended. If I could
Okay.
use that imagery. And the idea that what I'd like to do is cover one chief idea, have you really give your thoughts on it, and then I'll tell you what that is in a second. And then make sure we allow about 10 minutes. I want to be able to give the audience a chance to engage with you on some of your recent work. You know, obviously the low-hanging fruit at this point would be your recent book on Paul, but then also some of the other stuff you've been engaged with, that you've been writing about extensively, whatever you feel like would be of interest to the audience, just so people can get a chance to engage with that. But the idea that I wanted to maybe hammer home a little bit more, we talked about it a little bit before, and then it's kind of weaved through the thread of your comments, and that's this very mysterious concept that Paul distinguishes himself in this idea that he seems to conceptualize himself as a redeemer figure himself, almost like many have compared him to Apollonius. This idea that he sees himself as someone who is almost not Moses, but like you said, almost like a second Christ or a Christ-like figure, where he is standing in on behalf of his Gentile communities, and he is actually procuring a form of salvation for them as long as they stay with his message. And I was wondering, as you were talking, even though Ephesians is considered pseudepigrapha, what this concept of the one new man that's articulated in Ephesians in relationship to Pauline thought. I don't know if you have opinions about the authorship of Ephesians, but just if you could spend a few minutes talking about this very mysterious concept that Paul has.
Yeah, I would just call it Deutero-Pauline. I think
rather than pseudepigrapha. Okay.
Yeah, pseudepigrapha actually now refers to a body of works that scholars have done, you know, like Jubilees and
so I misapplying the term there a little bit.
Forth. So probably Deutero-Pauline.
Okay.
Well, I think, I suppose I could see a little bit of that in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about, you know, for three, spiritual body, and we're all one body and so forth. So it's not as though he doesn't have that idea, but in Ephesians, it's developed in more, it's developed in a very different way. I think it comes across to me as secondarily Paul in that sense. But I guess what I would want to know is what role does he see his own self in the 7 letters? I would almost be tempted to bring in Colossians. And if I was going to make an 8th letter, Colossians, by the way, not Ephesians, because there he's got the, you know, Galatians has touch not, taste not, handle not, the traditions of men. Colossians has that too. New moon, Sabbath, probably calendar disputes like you and I are both very familiar with among Torah seeking people. You know, what calendar do we use, and how did you do the new moon, and Hillel or observed, and so forth. So he sees himself, and I'll just kind of hint at this, and we should discuss this more, Paul's view of his own role, because that could be a whole program. In Colossians, he does say he fills up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ.
Yes.
He also says in Galatians, let no man trouble me, I bear in my body the stigmata, the marks of the Lord Jesus. And he probably means my bruised cheekbone, my broken nose, I think he looked a mess.
Probably.
He refers to that in Galatians.
From being beaten with
my
rods.
bodily presence was a trial for you. I mean, you can just imagine all kinds of things in terms of the kind of, and he mentions that in the letters about, you know, I was left for dead, I was stoned so many times, I was this, I was beaten, he's pretty. So but it's not like I'm so important, I'm Paul. It's I'm participating in the redemptive process. Follow me as I follow Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't just want them to go out and get, I say stone, you got to be careful with that. Go out and get hit with stones and left for dead or beaten with whips or rods. I mean, if that comes up in terms of serving God, you would do that. But what he wants them to even apply it to, like, why can't you get along? 1 Corinthians 15.
Right.
Why do you have divisions and you bite and devour each other? And any social group always breaks up with people not getting along and people getting their feelings hurt and people me, and I didn't get this. And, you know, I'm sure Rod has it in his community where good people, but misunderstandings and who's on first. And,
Yep.
you know, it's just tough. So he basically says, just suffer wrong. You know what? So what if you're sued or you're
Mm-hmm.
mistreated? What? Look at the example of Jesus. So he's got this thing about Jesus, but yeah, you've got to do it. He says in Romans 8, after all this glorious cosmic salvation, provided that we suffer with him, that we may be glorified with him. So he's still got this. So I don't want to make it where he's doing it for you.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually doing it kind of ahead of you. And here, you know, Jason Staples, I don't know if you know about Jason. He's a new scholar Bart Ehrman student, and he came up with the idea that Paul's Gentiles include at least the scattered tribes of Israel, the diaspora. They become not my people because of Paul's language in Romans 9. And when he says, when all the fullness of the Gentiles come in, that's actually a phrase from Genesis 48 about the tribes, Ephraim being a fullness in the earth, that he actually sees himself as Christ went to the circumcision, I'm going to the uncircumcision. And in doing that, what will happen? Two things will happen. Mm-hmm. Kol Yisrael will be gathered under the one God, you know, and so forth. And with them, a mighty force of righteousness will also come. And you get that in the prophets, like Isaiah 56, blesses the man who lays hold on the Sabbath and so forth. And I will gather to him more others than are already gathered. And this sort of
seems
Isaiah
to rely on Isaiah's ideas a lot.
So Jason has actually written a book. He's actually got a called, it's just out this week, I think, and I ordered it, just called Jason Staples. He did a JBL, Journal of Biblical Literature article a few years ago that's easy to find on JSTOR, but it's about Romans 9 through 11. So he's got this new book out on what do you mean Israel in the Second Temple period. I'll just say Israel, the Jews, Judah. People just use these like they're all the same. They're not the same. Mm-hmm. If James says to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, and as you know, some rabbis, Jews, and so forth are just very sensitive about this because they go, well, that's us. We're it. We're everything. And, you know, we'll forget Paul. But I'm talking about what Paul might have believed, not what, you know, people might say today. And I think he believes that Israel's been scattered through the nations. As Amos says, not the least grain will fall to the earth. My eyes are on all their ways. God knows these people. He's going to call them home. Also going to pull with them a great, huge force of non-Israelites that are going to become the New World Order, to use a really scary term. But I mean the Isaiah 65 New World Order, the new heavens and new earth. And that's reflected even in the book of Revelation. The nations will walk in the light of the city. The city's Israel, you know, the 12 tribes. And the 12 apostles ruling over 12 tribes. That's Revelation 21. And the nations walk in the light of the city, which is basic Judaism's idea. I don't think Revelation is Christian, by the way. It's been Christianized. But if you look at Bart Ehrman's blog today, he posted one of my articles.
Oh, yeah. I'll have to go check
and there'll be another one on Friday. And you can read it free, even though he has a subscription price for all of his blog. But anyway, I argue that there's a pre-Christian book that's actually fairly Jewish, if for apocalyptic Judaism. But anyway, he says, and the leaves along the river of life are that bear fruit 12 months a year for the healing of the nations.
Yeah.
Which goes back to Genesis 12, 1-3. And you will all the nations bless. So anybody that just wants to save Israel, I mean, just, so I'm trying to think of his first name. Ben-Amozeg, was it Ben-Amozeg's book? I think is it Israel and the Nations or something? I think it's Elijah Ben-Amozeg. Ben-Amozeg, he's a rabbi from maybe the 1700s. Look him up. It's a wonderful book. Oh, it's life-changing to read. And he basically says what Judaism always says: the only purpose of the chosenness and calling to the nations. That's right. It's like the job. Uncle Sam wants you, and you go, what does he want me for? Because we got to go bring the world back to God.
Right.
We got to fix the world, tikkun olam. Well, how are you going to fix the world unless people turn to the one God, the creator, and so forth and so on?
Let me ask you, I wasn't going to do this, but as you've explained this, I'm going to indulge and throw out a radical idea. It's my show. I'm going to do it. So I interviewed Robert Price, and of course, as you may know, Robert Price subscribes to the high critical theory of the Dutch critical method, which basically, you're familiar with it, but for the sake of the audience, it basically posits the idea that all the letters of Paul are forgeries, and they're all basically the children of the Marcionic expression of the middle second century. One of the things that I've struggled with as I've tried to wrestle with some of these theories, because I vacillate back and forth between whether Paul was a Roman operative trying to undermine the Messianic movement, or whether there's a lot of different ways you can look at Paul.
Oh boy, there are ideas out there and books.
Oh yeah, and I was wondering,
Josephus wrote the New Testament.
Oh yeah,
the Galilean is really
right,
Christ, and
there's a lot of exactly. But I guess what I wanted to bounce off you for a second was, is it possible, and have there been scholars that have wrestled with this? I don't know.
Is it possible? Always is yes.
Yeah, right. It's a loaded opening right there.
Is it Is it likely?
Is it likely? The different question. Okay, so we have this, what you just talked about with Paul. I've had people say that, well, Paul was basically starting a Noahide movement, but of course, where that argument breaks down is there's no Noahide movement that requires you to believe in a particular individual for your righteousness.
That's right.
Paul definitely asserts that you must believe in Jesus. And so is it possible that there's an authentic Paul that was doing kind of a Noahide thing and yet arguing with some of the religious leaders of his day? And then later on, there was this interpolated element of his letters that was attached to try to fit into later theological constructs?
I don't think it's likely. These 7 letters, the complexity of them, I'm not trying to pull rank here with anybody.
No. I'm just interested in your
thoughts. No, with Robert, we've met at conferences. We're not personal, but we certainly like each other, and he's reviewed my Jesus Dynasty pretty negatively, which is fine.
I didn't even know that.
But, and I don't care. I want negative reviews. I want to, if they're good arguments, I want to hear things. I don't know that he said anything about Paul and Jesus, but no, I don't. I think a 50s AD Paul in those 7 letters, I think it's remarkable what we get. But the reason you can't posit he's founding a Noahide movement or anything like that, operationally, yes, he's applying what could be called Noahide to his converts, because that's what Judaism does with non-Jews. So yes, that's an operational thing. But that's not the message. I call that coming in from the cold. That's like, what do you do to just clean yourself up a little bit so that you can participate in this cosmic redemption? And that's where his role is, helping the redemption, bringing the dispersed back, whether they're Israelites or not. I don't know that he means DNA Israelites. the rabbis talk about a Yiddish neshama, maybe just a
Yeah.
thing in the person. But either way, he's bringing back people that'll say, I've turned from idols to the one, so forth. And that is just subsidiary to, well, for what? Like, okay, you're cleaned up, Titus. You're not circumcised, you're a Noahide. Why? For what?
Right.
Because this world is passing away, and next summer or 2 years from now, we're going to begin to see everything dissolving. Therefore, I don't even know that you need to get married.
Right. He talks about that. Yeah.
Were you thinking of starting a business?
Mhm.
There's coming a time, according to, I think he alludes to Isaiah 24. If you read Isaiah 24, the Isaiah apocalypse, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the master, so with the servant. He names it's all going to be overturned. It's all going to pass away. So why would you buy in? The time has come when those who have wives have none. What is that? Everybody's going to get a divorce? No, there won't even be male and female. There won't even be Jew and Greek.
Because
so the Torah
being an apocalyptic,
is ready to pass away.
Right.
And we don't have time to explore this, but we should come back and talk about, is Paul Torah observant? And I would say, not trying to be a smart, depends on who he's talking to.
Right.
Is Paul Torah observant? I think 1 Corinthians 9, I'm going to take him at his word. To the Jews, I become as a Jew. What do you mean as a Jew? You are a Jew.
Right.
To those under the law, I become as under the law.
Meaning the perception of his audience, how they view what a Jew would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not under the law to Christ, because the transformation is coming. And what is that even going to mean? He's trying to get, like, are people going to worry about days, months, seasons, and years? Touch not, taste not, handle not. All, at which he says things that are perishing, things that are going to pass away. And that's what people divide and start sects and groups, and you don't do this blessing. Paul's just like, and to the Gentiles, I become as a Gentile, meaning I think he would have eaten whatever was set before him if he was invited to a Gentile home. I know a lot of people, no,
I agree with that. I think that's pretty
but I think he would. And he basically tells others, but does James know this is the problem?
Right.
Does the word reach Jerusalem? Because according to Acts, who's smoothing everything over, the author, when James questions him about that, Paul doesn't answer.
Right.
He says, people are saying that you're teaching Jews that they don't even have to keep the Torah because it's all passing away. In order that people will know that that's not true, come and do this and that in the temple with the
Okay, I'll do that.
Power.
Sure.
But Luke, the author of Luke X, doesn't let Paul answer.
Right.
And I don't know what Paul would have said. He might have said, well, look, James, come on.
But James gave him an out. He didn't have to answer. Yeah.
How near are we to the end?
So
I'm telling you that
let's finish
that
up.
apocalypticism.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were done your thought.
That apocalypticism determines everything.
Yep.
A whole chapter. And notice the form of this world. It's the schema in Greek. Schema of the cosmos. Wow, that means the primary structure, scheme would be our word. The primary underpinnings and scheme of the entire Genesis 1 creation is passing right now, present tense, but it's not gone yet. So yeah, there's still Jew, Gentile, but it's passing, and I think he's going to live to see it. I'm for Schweitzer. Schweitzer wrote the greatest book on Paul ever, in my opinion. It's called The Mysticism of Paul the Apostle. Nobody ever reads it.
I haven't read it. I'm going to get it. I'm going to read it.
It's unbelievable. He didn't even have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's just unbelievable. I just stand in his shadow. And the Jesus dynasty is dedicated to him because he also wrote the greatest book on the historical Jesus ever. And basically 80-90% that work in New Testament do believe that this apocalypticism is the real key. And it's also the great problem. So you got the preterists that say, oh, it was all fulfilled, nothing failed. And you got the futurists that say, well, a day with the Lord is 1,000 years. And then you got the historians that read it and say, you can't read Paul without thinking Jesus is ready to just show himself.
There's an
And
urgency.
it's not 70. It's
Mhm.
not 70 AD in the Roman armies. I know that's in Luke 21, Mark 13. He says, we who are alive and remain will be caught by the Lord in the air, and those who are dead will. I mean, this is, you can't mythologize that, in my opinion. Now, N.T. Wright, he's a friend of mine. We haven't talked in years. Our paths haven't crossed. I keep up with him, but I think he wants a lot of preterists all fulfilled in new covenants here, so forth. But I think we catch Paul at a moment where we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like, oh, the new covenant's here. Israel's been regathered. There's a new Israel. It's all, we can do away. No, he thinks it's coming, but he doesn't think it's there yet.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, because many of the conditions that are required for some of the things he talks about, we just simply don't have. Right.
Yeah,
exactly. It's plainly empirically obvious that some things have not happened yet. Right. So how does this book, you just did this release, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, I want to give you a chance to talk about it again. This book that you just re-released, that you've kind of spruced up, maybe edited a bit, Paul's Ascent to Paradise.
Yeah, it's edited a lot, actually. Large portions are rewritten because
So a lot of work.
I've changed in 35 years.
I imagine, right. So I of course want the audience to get Paul and Jesus, which has been the subject.
Of course.
But now, would you recommend I get this book after reading that, or this book before it?
I would say Paul and Jesus first, for sure. And it's called The Apostolic Message and Mission in the Light of His Mystical Experiences. So it kind of rides on...
but it's specifically about a lot of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the book, is my translation of Genesis. I think I have one here somewhere. Anyway, they can go look at it. There's one over there. I don't need to go get it. And then I have a book on Mary, but it's not out yet. It's out in French, but not in English yet. It's held up because of all the COVID stuff.
Oh.
I would recommend Ross Nichols' book, The Moses Scroll, about the Shapira Dead Sea Scroll.
You've been writing a lot about this, yeah.
Discovered in 1878, because it claims to be something that you get hinted at in the book of Deuteronomy. And that's Dershowitz, not the lawyer Dershowitz, but Edon Dershowitz, the young Israeli scholar, brilliant young scholar. And Nichols is giving the story, but he also has a reconstruction of the text. And what the text claims to be is the valediction of Moses, the speech of Moses on the east side of the Jordan to the people of Israel. And I'm interested in just whether it is forged or an ancient Dead Sea Scroll. Obviously, people with a canonized Torah, Deuteronomy's inspired very conservative Christians or Jews, don't really care if you find a Dead Sea Scroll that reads differently from, the Masoretic text. But certainly for Dead Sea Scroll studies, if it's ancient and it was found in Moab, in what's called Wadi Mujiv or Aran. So Ross's, you can get Edon's book free on academia.edu, and it's a big, thick, probably 500-page academic book, but it's free access, which is fantastic. But Ross's book is a thrill to read. It's the story of Shapira. So I'm very interested in that. Interests me is I wonder whether it might have been available to the Jesus movement. I'm going to write an article in Bar Magazine.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah.
Because the précis it presents of the Torah, some of which is in Deuteronomy, but it just echoes so many times some of the things we get in Paul and Jesus about particularly the 10 Commandments and so forth. So it depends on your view of text and canonization and Masoretic texts. And I think most of your listeners know, I mean, all forms of Judaism use the Masoretic texts. I've got one right here. I use my old JPS that I've had since 1971. And it's the 1917 edition because I like the literalness of it. It's out
Yeah.
of print. But I have I have, of course, 500 Hebrew Bibles around the place here. But also I'm just interested in the textual questions because I work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they do have versions of the Torah, of the prophets, of the writings that have some different readings that are quite interesting. So if this is part of that, I want to know that. Now, Dershowitz claims that it's the book that Jeremiah refers to in the time of Josiah. We found the book of the law.
Oh, wow.
And it is a little scroll that Moses wrote.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the we'll
Right.
think of it today or even, but it's a little scroll that Moses wrote, mentioned in Deuteronomy that he wrote it. And it gives you the basic summary of the Torah, and it was put in the side of the box. I call it the box, not the ark, because everybody, Ark of the Covenant. No, it's a box. You know? And I'm talking about the Deuteronomy 10, the wooden box that Moses makes, Deuteronomy 10. He's told to make it out of wood. Yep. It's then put in the gold box later, apparently, by some tradition. So I'm just very intrigued with the Shapira scroll, and I want to find it. So I'm really intrigued with finding
it. You've been really focused on that, and
because
involved in archaeology.
It will come up, and then when we do radiocarbon and so forth, it'll either come out as a medieval manuscript that Shapira forged, or as I think it's going to come out as ancient, and then the question is how ancient. So, but it really is an amazing scroll to read. You get it in books.
And what would be your anticipated reaction to by the academic community and by the religious community if evidence seems to suggest that this scroll is authentic?
Well, if it's Second Temple, that's one thing. If it's First Temple, that's another whole ball game. If it's First Temple, it just, say it came out 900 BC, the actual leather that it's written on, with carbon. And carbon dating can be pretty accurate if the tests are done properly. I dated a shroud. It's the only burial shroud ever found in Jerusalem. And I used the lab in Arizona, the same lab, the Turin shroud. And when I got the letter back, it was just amazing. It says, I think it said 36 CE plus or minus 20 years.
Wow.
And I'm like, wow. So this cloth.
That's amazing.
So it was right smack dab in the middle of the time of Jesus. And it shows this, if your people go to my blog, jamestabor.com, it's got a good search feature. You can type in Tomb of the Shroud and, get all the articles in there. Also, the corpse had hair preserved because it was sealed with no moisture. So it didn't all go back to dust. So we got some hair. We have women's hair at Masada. Now we got a whole head of men's hair.
Oh, wow.
That you can talk about the hair and the style and, the color. And anyway, so the carbon dating would tell everything. It would just be amazing. I'm also involved in Exodus stuff. I'm kind of getting out of just my New Testament stuff because I got interested in biblical Tamar down in the Negev and the excavation there, which is the southernmost border of ancient Judah during the 9th, 8th, and 7th century BC. And Tally Erickson is the person that's writing all that up and maybe some more digging. I'm real interested in where Horeb is, not Horeb,
right?
Wilderness of Paran. Some of those things I'm not getting totally, I'm not giving up on origins, but I think like when Paul says I went into Arabia, I think he's going to where he thinks is Horeb.
That's always a mysterious claim.
And I say that I show that in the book. I try to demonstrate that. And so it does have some, New Testament validity. And there could be a polemic against it in Hebrews where it says, we've not come to a mountain that can be touched and so forth,
Right. Like you alluded to earlier, there's definitely some Pauline ideas within Hebrews, but from what I've read, and I'm not a scholar, but from what I've read, it seems much more likely to be Clement.
So we're finishing up Mount Zion. We haven't been able to go for 2 years. I started a YouTube channel, by the way, if you
I
look
did
for my
see that.
YouTube
Yeah.
channel, because I put up 10 videos today. So I
So
really
people should
build
know
that
that
up.
too. They should subscribe to your YouTube channel as
And
well.
I'll certainly put yours up, and you can post all that with your video. But the reason I mention that is I have quite a few on Mount Zion that I'm beginning to put up. It's a really interesting dig site, and we're finishing it up. And what it is is how the wealthy lived right up to the eve of the destruction of Jerusalem in the most affluent part of the city.
Huh.
And that's really interesting. Probably priestly, not necessarily friends of the rabbis, as the Talmud curses some of the,
Yeah.
of the Annas family and all of those people. So I'm mostly interested in Dead Sea Scrolls, actually. And here's a chance to maybe find one that might be a Dead Sea Scroll.
Yeah, that would be so exciting, right?
But also, I want to know everything we can know about I just am so fascinated, have been for 30 years, with the Library of Qumran, and reading it in the light of late Second Temple Judaism, and then understanding the Jesus movement as Eisman says, as messianic. Some people say don't say Palestine, but he is the late Second Temple Palestine Messianic Apocalyptic movement, of which James is the leader, as well as the teacher and so forth. I don't think James is the teacher, but piety, that kind of approach to things.
The aesthetic, yeah.
Right, which I don't think Paul would buy too much, except maybe he'd buy part of it for like the next 2 years. He does tell women, like, cover yourself with your hair and so forth. And he's willing to enforce things that have not passed away yet.
Yep.
Like, I think they set separately, probably. Possibly men and women set separately. Well, does that mean they didn't get up and mix when they're in the spirit worshiping charismatically? I don't know.
That's the interesting. So it seems like several points to this afternoon you've alluded to this, that where Paul seems to be easily accused of trying to start a new religious movement, you would tend to be more gracious towards him in the sense that you feel like it's the urgency of the apocalyptic vision that he has that makes it seem like he's trying to do away, because he just sees the timeline being such that some stuff.
And to make the Christ figure this new figure of cosmic salvation in whom you have to believe, a new Moses, clearly says that in 2 Corinthians. There's a new Moses, his glory billion times greater than Moses' glory. That is not Judaism, per se. And whether it supersedes Judaism is a question that everyone has to grapple with, just as they have to grapple with whether Islam supersedes both those.
Right. Well, yeah, Islam conceptualizes itself as the keepers of the original. Right.
So Paul he's the linchpin, he's the key. I mean, if we have his letters, if Price is right, then we're reading about Marcion in 2nd century.
It's hard because I don't tend to agree with that perspective, but I don't easily dismiss the Marcionic influence either.
Certainly, it takes over with Luke Acts and begins to become dominant, and people's minds. That's what really counts.
Yeah, right.
Luther's a Marcionite when he says, I just want to read Romans and Galatians.
Yeah.
I don't really care about James. Well, you're a Marcionite.
Right.
He even put it in the back of his Bible, by the way.
Really?
Did you know that? He put it in small print in the back. If you get the Luther Bible.
I haven't looked at it.
Yeah, so that's Marcion. So the influence, but I'll tell you, I started to say this and it sounded, I've read these letters. I started reading these letters when I was 17 in Greek, these 7 letters. I was in college, Abilene Christian University. One thing Abilene does, boy, are they good in the biblical languages, and I had teachers from Harvard, Abraham Malherbe, Everett Ferguson. Some people know these are just amazing scholars. degrees from Harvard and all these schools. And so I start reading when I'm 17, 18, 19, 20. Then in Chicago, I'm writing on Paul. That's, this book comes out of that experience. I read them. It's not exaggerating to say I sat and my Greek got so good that I'm just reading like you would read English, but I'm reading the Greek.
Yeah.
So it's not like, well, how's this translated? I'm reading. I've read them 100 times at least. And after a while, I don't know that I could argue it as much as I just sense this is not forged. It's got a rhythm to it. He interrupts himself. It's got all the home. Now it's a lot like the Shapiroscopes. Yeah, but a really good forger can even put that in to fool you. There's a limit to that, believe me.
It has some tells, right? There's some tells that you would pick up on.
It has some tells and, the so-called difficult things that I don't see in a way that it fits the second century, but I see how the second century can look back and fit itself to Paul, especially if you think Paul gave the new thing.
Right.
And we don't even need the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible or
right. That would
anything.
be the Messianic perspective.
Yeah. And he does get close to that. I mean, Second Corinthians mentions the 10 Commandments, the tablets, this, and now you're the tablets.
He seems to feed the belly of the Gnostics too. He gives them a lot of material.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I hope to go back to Israel. I'm doing a tour, but
I saw you talking about that. Yeah.
So it's my spring break. I think it's the first week of March. People can look for that on my blog again.
Have you been back since the beginning of COVID?
I'm hoping that we'll be able to go by March. We've already moved it twice. So I imagine immunizations will be required. So if people aren't going to do that, they're probably not going to be going to Israel for a while.
Right.
But it's not Paul as much because we'd need to go to Greece and Turkey and everywhere to do Paul. We talk a lot. It's mainly a chance for me to hang out, read my books, frankly. But because I work on Christianity, we do a lot. But Ross does it with me, Ross Nichols. And we're going to go down to the Sinai. We're going to go down to the Horeb area and Mount Hor. And, so we're going to do a lot of Hebrew Bible stuff and talk. I tend to do more of the Jesus stuff. So the Jesus Dynasty book would be like the tour sort of built around those things. Like you get to see Sepphoris and all these places. And you get all my latest theories on Christianity and so forth. But it's mainly these tours, we make them small and can sit at night. And that's where the tour really takes place. You do all this stuff all day.
Yeah.
Then you have dinner, maybe take a walk, and then you come and just sit. You don't get a lot of sleep during these tours unless you just want to go to bed. It's hard to go to bed before midnight because we just sit around and
talking. Yeah.
You can imagine everybody just wants to talk about everything.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So it's really,
I imagine
and the people bond like you wouldn't believe. Jews.
Yeah.
Skeptics, atheists,
the barriers
believers,
are gone.
Because they're all drawn by the same thing. What is this thing called that we're also intrigued with culturally?
Isn't it fascinating, James, how sometimes you'll read someone and they'll go out of their way to tell you that they're an atheist, but all they want to do is talk about God.
Yeah.
And the things of the religion and
and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's
I respect, there's more faith and honest doubt than half the creeds. Was that Voltaire or somebody said? Absolutely believe that. I've got my doubts.
Sure.
I'm fully critical with my own thoughts.
Yep.
And yet I've just been a Bible lover, probably age 10 or 11. And I just can't even believe I get to do what I do. It's not work.
That's a wonderful place for us to end. This has been a delightful conversation, James. I really appreciate you taking such a generous time here. I've learned a lot listening to you. I could listen to you for hours on this subject. I'm jealous of your students who get to go to school and spend hours and hours doing this. but we get to do this here today. So it's been a privilege for me, and I hope we get to do it again. And
Okay.
maybe yeah, it really was very enjoyable, and we can maybe plan out maybe another conversation. But I'm excited about some of the stuff you've talked to me about. You've given me a list of books that I need to go now get.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I
Yeah.
recommend the
See what you
audience.
think of Jonathan Staples. It's
Yeah.
kind of, it's a Cambridge University Press book, so it's not like $15, but
Sure, yeah,
it's
it's
worth it.
not like
It's
Brill.
worth it.
Like Brill's expensive.
Yeah, it's not like Brill. It's,
You'll
I don't
know it's
know.
like Brill.
But he's going to have another book right away, and it's going to be on Romans 9 through 11, and
Oh,
that's going
really?
to be, that's going
Oh,
to
wow.
rock. I'm telling you, he's causing some waves. He
This
teaches
is
at
the
North.
one that's studying under Erman.
Well, he's out now.
Oh,
He's teaching at North Carolina State University.
oh, okay. So he's on the road from you a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
he's rocking some boats, but he's such a careful scholar. It's a
Yeah, so it's
pleasure to
hard to poke
read.
a lot of holes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
That's,
just a pleasure to read Jason's work.
I'll
And
definitely check that out. Yeah, and it's well, it's exciting, like you said, because when you have a passion for the work, and then you can engage with other minds that further that passion,
yeah,
it encourage us to continue on, and as a layperson, reading these ideas is so thought-provoking. And that's one of the things that I find that, my study of Judaism was so liberating for me, because the richness of the Jewish tradition of thought, the dialectic of the Talmudic mind, and the different ways that Judaism wrestles with ideas philosophically, has always been fascinating for me. And I know that as I've gotten older, I guess the biggest distinction between myself today and my younger self is that I give myself the liberty to not be so sure about some things today that maybe I
yeah.
felt intimidated to be unsure about before.
Yeah, the problem with Paul, I'll close with this for Paul. It's the challenge. It's the Schweitzer challenge. It's the challenge through the ages. It's what he most expected to happen didn't happen.
Right.
And I'm not just talking about, oh, Jesus didn't come. I'm talking about all the stuff pinning all his arguments on. It hasn't come. The form of this world has not passed away.
Right.
We have injustice and suffering and death, and this world needs fixing more than ever.
Yep.
And it is not repaired by any means. And so should we hate? No, but we might learn lessons about don't necessarily wish for the quick fix.
Right.
Even if you believe Jesus is in heaven and going to come again and do it all.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. It didn't. So you got to read Paul with that in mind.
Yeah.
And Jesus then is a failed apocalyptic teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I don't cheer over that. I actually am very, very drawn to the historical Jesus in terms of some of his Torah ethics and insights.
Mm-hmm.
But there's there are quite a few rabbis that have also understood that through history and been able, particularly in the modern world, to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to
Right.
speak.
And to separate the historicity of the events and the people from the way that the dogmatic expression has gone forward and expressed itself. Yeah.
Unfortunately, everything got summarized, Dave, as you believe in Christ, your sins are forgiven, you die and go to heaven.
Yeah.
And you go, and that's the message. You go, I'm reading Paul, and that's really not the message.
Right.
You dying and going to heaven. Right. It's about whether this world is going to get fixed or not. And I'm using fix like capital F.
Right.
Is it going to obtain its cosmic destiny? Or is it just atoms in the void and the sun will become a giant orange star and will burn up long before that happens? And when you're dead and that's it. Is that it? Or, so that's
right. So what you're saying is there's a deeper philosophical stream that's running here that gets ignored. Yeah. That's powerful. Yeah.
So we'll talk again. We'll give it some time. Let people see if they like listening to me drone on. But
yeah, this is a long form conversation.
We can do philosophy. We can. I'm what's called a process theist. I mean, that's the label I get.
Okay.
So that is interesting. I have a different view of the Garden of Eden. I don't know if you know Jono Vander, but he has 2U, truth, 2 in the
I'm
work.
not. I know there's a scholar in Penn State or UPenn.
No, this is more of a Torah guy.
Oh, okay.
That teaches, Jono Vander. Anyway, the reason I mention it is I did 8 programs with him called Gleanings from Genesis, where I used translation that's out. And we kind of blew people away because I gave a different interpretation of Eden, that it's not the fall of humans at all, that it is actually the way things were supposed to be, according to Genesis and Paul and even Jesus. So there's all kinds of things we can talk about.
Talking about that, because I when I studied the,
in other words, they were supposed to bite into the root of the forbidden fruit. That wasn't a failing, because Moses says in Deuteronomy, "Your little children who have not yet the knowledge of good and evil," like they're going to, when they become accountable. Paul says that in Romans 7. Before I knew the Torah, I was just,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, there's a bunch of stuff out there. We probably took too long.
Well, that's okay.
What's
No, this
amazing?
has been a great
If
conversation.
anyone could listen to this whole show, they're hooked. I mean, they're
I
hooked.
agree.
The stuff we're hooked on.
If they make it this far, you're part of the club now. So yeah.
Well, some of them are going to say like, "Damn, I wish you would have kept talking," and others are going to say, "God, 2 hours? Are you kidding me?"
Yeah. Well, yeah, but those people are not going to make it through the first 20 minutes anyway. So
yeah.
But all right. Well,
okay. Take care, David. It's a
very
real
good.
pleasure, and you talk more next time with questions if we.
Oh no, this was great. I talked enough. So
okay, great.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Take care.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Thank you.
Mhm.